people are what make business go around. And we forget that sometimes because we're so head down, focused on the technology or focused on the business and not thinking about the importance of maintaining those relationships. When I look at where I've landed here, I'm very, very appreciative for the people that have helped me along the way.
Welcome to Entrepreneur's Handbook Podcast, where we share inspiring startup stories with practical takeaways for you, the listener. Today's guest is Jason Foster, the CEO of Ori BioTech. They're building a platform which helps manufacture life-saving drugs cheaper and quicker, which means that more patients can get the medicine that they need to survive. And they've already raised just shy of 140 million after their Series B. Jason is truly passionate about the healthcare industry and sits on the board of multiple other companies that are making a real impact. He's got a deep history of growing these companies and helping them to overcome operational burdens so they can do what really matters. He loves helping people. So if you're in this space, I recommend you get in touch with him. I love chatting to him. It was inspirational. Let's get on to the show. Welcome to Entrepreneur's Handbook, Jason. It's a pleasure to get you on.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been great to be here.
So you're now working at Ori BioTech and you're leading the company and they've done huge, amazing work. But you've got a different background to many people who are coming into a company right at the early stages. Can you tell us what got you into the startup world and building businesses?
Sure. It's been a bit of a journey. I studied political science as an undergrad and went to Washington, D.C. to work in politics as my first job out of undergrad, which is maybe a little bit of an interesting career choice. I was a starry-eyed idealist at 21 years old, thinking I could go to Washington and change the world. When you get there, when you see the sausage making that happens behind the scenes, it's pretty ugly. And you realize, and I quickly realized, that really it was the private sector that was driving change, not the public sector. And this was about the time in the sort of run up to the dot-com bubble. So kind of 97 to 2000, we saw a massive explosion in tech entrepreneurship and VC investment, et cetera. And it was super exciting. And I wanted to kind of find a way to get involved. So I actually left Capitol Hill to go work at my first startup in 2000. And this was something totally unrelated to what I do now, but I was the second employee, venture-backed startup. It was a politically oriented startup. And that kind of flamed out and crashed and burned within 10 months, which was an interesting experience. As we watched the dot-com bubble burst, all that happened around us. And I was young enough at that point where it wasn't terminal. But that was my first kind of startup exposure, which I loved the experience of. But obviously after the kind of economic downturn, after the dot-com bubble burst and after 9/11 in the US, there was a kind of a period where there wasn't a lot or as much, kind of entrepreneurship and activity happening. So I went back to business school at that point. I went to Columbia for business school and wanted to make a switch into healthcare. Was kind of one of the reasons why I went to business school. I had worked in healthcare policy and thought that would be a very interesting way to take my career. So went back into the corporate world after business school, went to work for Merck, the big pharma company, in one of their divisions, which was called Medco, and then did some consulting and actually always with an eye to how could I get back to a smaller, startup kind of environment. So in between, I graduated from business school in 2003, and then in 2006, I joined a small startup pharma company. It was a specialty pharma company focused in CNS, so in pain and addiction in this case. And we built that business from just a few of us. There were kind of 4 or 5 of us on the management team at the beginning. And then we built that to over 1,100 people over 10 years. And so that was a kind of really interesting startup journey, first in the US, as you can tell by my funny accent, I'm American, but also, and then that's what brought me to Europe. So halfway through in 2010, we had grown the business at that point to 400 people and $1 billion in revenue. And then they said, hey, Jason, you want to go to Europe and build the European operation? And so I came over here and started again from scratch in the same company with the European operation for that business. So I've had a couple different startup experiences along the way, some successful, some not successful, but always have had the bug for building things, building businesses, and getting involved, kind of getting my hands dirty as an operator as opposed to an investor, which I've done some of as well, as you know, and we might talk about that as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned there you worked in healthcare policy, and that's what got you into the healthcare space for startups. What was it about healthcare that really attracted you? What was it that made it so interesting?
I think what initially attracted me was, the ability to really kind of impact, people's lives in a positive way. Now I see, fast forwarding to today, I see lots of super talented people innovating in technology and applying their expertise to becoming, the 17th payment startup or the 106th, software to enable people to buy more crap they don't need online. Like, there's a lot of ways you can apply your talents. And it seemed to me at that point in my career that healthcare was a good area to get involved in because it could have a positive impact. And, I could accomplish, some of the other goals that I wanted professionally, personally, financially. And so it kind of ticked a lot of the boxes that I wanted to get exposure to in my career.
Do you think like working in Capitol Hill and working in politics helped you at all in the early stages of being like an entrepreneur or like in a scrappy startup? Like what did that experience teach you?
I think it did actually. And it's funny because I often tell the story of my career path and it all sounds very logical and well thought out in retrospect. But when you're in it, you're sort of going from one, trying to make the best of the decision you can with the information you have. And you're sort of like, well, this makes sense. And then maybe that doesn't make sense anymore. And moving over here makes sense. And, going to Capitol Hill made sense at the time. And when I look back on that experience, I started out at the bottom. I was making, I think, $19,000 a year in my first job, answering the phone at the front desk of a congressional office, fetching coffee, making copies, all, using my degree to its utmost ability. But what it teaches you is a bit of humility. It teaches you to be flexible. It teaches you to be hungry, sort of, if I'm going to make coffee, I'm going to make the best darn coffee I can make, to really just prove yourself to be able to make it onto the next rung of the ladder or to make, to get that next promotion, that next responsibility. And, I think starting out at the bottom is beneficial. Everyone should have those experiences where, you're really doing something that's not what you want, where you want to end up. And you realize, well, there is value here to working hard and really, demonstrating success early so you can get up, you can progress your career in a way that you want to.
And then when that first startup failed after about 10 months, you said, Did you ever regret that decision to go into startups? Was there any doubt there? Or were you like, no, this is what I love?
Yeah, no, it was an awesome experience regardless. And I think, you learn as much from your failures as you do from your successes and maybe more sometimes. One thing that I learned at a very high level at the end was don't take any company liabilities onto yourself. So I had put some company expenses onto my credit card because it was just, it needed to get done. And, that was the answer at that point. And when the company failed, not only did the last paycheck bounce, so they didn't pay me my last paycheck, but I also had to cover the debt off, which was not ideal. It wasn't a huge amount, but again, I was a starving, new grad. But yeah, I mean, it was an awesome experience. It was, it was an exciting time to be involved in. I learned a little bit about dealing with venture capitalists and, raising finance and some of those things that would sort of, certainly skills that I've built on in my later career and, hiring people into a startup. And, I hired employees, 3 through 10. I think we were at, or 7, we were at our peak. And I also learned a very critical lesson, which is you need to have a business model that works. We didn't have a business model that works. And it's crucial as a business to have a business model that works. Sometimes we forget about that, but it is absolutely critical to success. So, there's some of those lessons that I learned the hard way, but were very, very valuable.
I think it's interesting what you said there as well, because I know some people are starting businesses now, or even if it's just to create a business, but they don't really understand the finance side of it. And they do the same thing that you've done, right? They start putting it into their personal account to begin with. And like I did the same thing when I started doing things on the side. It was all going into my personal account. And then it became a nightmare to untangle.
It's an absolute nightmare.
It's just, people think, just get started and keep going. Because like you can create such a big problem for yourself down the road. Like I said, if your company fails, if you've taken on that personal liability. And at least in the UK, it's not very expensive to like create a company. It's worth doing it just to make it separate. And generally, I guess the same in the US as well, the tax benefits of doing that are also pretty good as well.
Yeah, and setting up your own bank account for the business, or getting an accountant, to file your, your accounts with Company's House, or whatever the things are. Like, there's a couple kind of hygiene things that are worth doing. I would absolutely, and even if, even if it's not, you're not a sole trader or, running your own business, but you're, incorporating a startup, it is easy to let the kind of lines get blurred between what's the individual and what's the company, and those kinds of things, and documentation. So I've seen several companies that didn't keep good documentation early about, there wasn't a shareholders agreement. So when the founders kind of walk in, they say, oh yeah, we'll just split the business 50-50, and we'll just kind of continue on. And I've seen that go wrong so many times. It's not documented anywhere. What happens if one of the partners leaves? Sometimes this happens. It doesn't work out, or they want to go back to school, or they see another opportunity, and they walk away with 50% of the equity, and then the partner who stays behind, is stuck because there's no agreement that says, well, if they, their shares vest over a certain amount of time, if they leave, there's a kind of clauses associated with that. And there's standard templates out there from the BVCA or others that you can grab a hold of, draft or a kind of template agreement. It's really, really important to have those hardware conversations in the very beginning, because otherwise, when you maybe have created a little bit of value, maybe you've raised your first financing and you've got a little bit of money in the bank, and then people sort of are much more, they're much more reticent to let go of the perceived value that they've created, when actually, all the value in a business is the execution over the long term. Ideas are cheap, but execution is everything. And, if a founder leaves early in the journey, they probably aren't entitled to anything, but certainly not 50% of the business is, and this is a problem I see very, very frequently.
Yeah. I think that's really difficult as well, especially when people are creating businesses with people they already know or they're friends with, where they use that informal attitude. But like, as we know, like we drift away from people, right? It's not necessarily that it doesn't have to be like a big argument or something like that. It's just people go in different directions in life.
Exactly.
And you've got to account for that, because if you don't, like you said, then it can become that cause of friction and become the cause of arguments. And if there's no written agreement, you don't really have any leg to stand on legally.
Exactly. And I think the default of having everyone get, if there's 3 founders, everyone get a third of the business, or 2 founders, 50-50, is, it should be thought out ahead of time. Who's bringing the most value to the business, whose skills are most important to the success of the business, who's going to do most of the work. These are factors that you should consider. I mean, it's an uncomfortable-ish conversation, but if it's a paper exercise, right, in the very beginning, the company isn't anything, right? You've got an idea. The default being that everyone gets, an equal share of the business. It should be thought out ahead of time. Is that the right thing to do? And because it always inevitably causes problems if it's not done properly.
Like with Ori BioTech, from my understanding, you weren't there right at the very beginning, but then you're working with the original founder, and you understood like that your skills matched up in a way where it made sense for you to come on board and become the CEO. Can you tell like the listeners more about that and how that situation worked out?
Yeah, it's a little bit of an unusual situation, I think. So in my experience, so I've been investing in working with health tech businesses, startups, again, since 2016. So give it 6 years or so. And you see all kinds of permutations, of course. But the kind of common thread, if you will, certainly amongst health tech startups, is you have founders that are deeply technical or clinical or, kind of scientific in their experience. So they've identified a problem or an opportunity utilizing technology and some sort of an insight that they had, and or an opportunity. If they were a clinician, they said, this is not working. Potentially we can find a solution for that. So those are usually the kind of most common makeups of startup teams in the health tech space. And it's great to have that depth of domain expertise. But they aren't the only things that are important for success as a startup. So you need people with operational expertise, with fundraising expertise, commercial expertise. These are critical to success. And one of the most common pieces of advice that I give to founders is that people really don't care about your technology. Most founders are technologists, and they want to talk about their technology because that's what they get excited about. That's how they got into the founding the business. But it's not really of interest to either customers or investors. What they want to know is, can you solve my problem, or is the problem you're solving big enough, and is someone willing to pay for it? in order to make this an investable opportunity, or to make this an investable partnership where I'm going to pay for your services or your technology. But the depths of how it works are really lost on most people, and they're far from the most important aspects of your business. So, when I met Farlan Verage, the founder of Ori, he is absolutely an expert in this area, in biochemical engineering, bioprocessing. His co-founder, Chris Mason, had spent 25 years in regenerative medicine. They were both professors at University College London at the time. They developed Ori outside of their work at UCL, but had a tremendous amount of expertise to bring to it. And it was that kind of story, very, very expert and a lot of depth in those areas, but maybe some support was necessary in the kind of more operational, commercial kind of fundraising aspects. And so, I was the third employee, I think either second or third. I can't remember what the order was exactly, but I was early on the team when I ended up joining full time. But I sort of went at risk with them. So I met them in late 2018 through an investor friend of mine as a potential investor. So I was investing full time at that point. After I left the business I was telling you about in 2016, I started investing, advising startups. I currently have a portfolio of 13 companies that I've invested in, and Ori is obviously one of them. So I had met the Ori team in late 2018 as a potential investor and looked at the opportunity, looked at the team, as investors do. Saw a few gaps that they could potentially help fill in the skill set and experience of the team, and got really excited about kind of the opportunity in cell and gene therapy and the opportunity and the innovation that Ori kind of was working on. So offered to help them go out and fundraise, offered to invest myself and then help them go out and fundraise and try and close the seed round that they were trying to close for several months. And so we went out and met with some of my contacts in the investment world and managed to put together a seed round for them in what ended up closing in August 2019. And that was led by DeLynn Ventures, Amadeus Capital, Kindred, who a couple other investors. And at that point, it was really a kind of decision of, what happens next. So I'd said to Farlan, we'll go out and fundraise. If we can raise successfully, then we'll decide what happens next. I don't have any preconceived notions about how I might get involved after that, but I essentially went at risk to help them fundraise. And this is another piece of advice that I give a lot of founders is, there's a lot of people who are willing to help you as a founder. Often all you have to do is ask, and people will give you the benefit of their time and their experience and their insights. There's also a layer of people out there, consultants and others, that will want to help for a fee. They want 1% of your business, or maybe they'll want a consultancy agreement. And I'm always very cautious in advising people to enter into those agreements until such time as the person has demonstrated their value. So similar to the way I did with Farlan, I said, if we can raise together, I'm going to try and help. And if I can help, then we'll see what happens after that. And this is the approach I've taken with all the companies that I've worked with, is that if I can add value, I'm going to prove it to you. I'm going to help introduce you to investors, to customers. I'm going to help set up your commercial operation. I'm going to help you figure out your business model, your strategy, your pitch. And if you find value there, then we'll discuss what it's worth to you and how we can kind of work together moving forward. But there is a layer of people that just want to kind of sit on your board or sit on your advisory board or get 1% of your company. And then they provide variable quality or, if any, value at all. And that is a mistake I see lots of founders making. So definitely try before you buy there. I guess given where I've ended up, I must have provided some value to Farlan because he asked me to join the business full time.
And like you mentioned there, but they were struggling to raise their seed round, or they were trying to do it for a few months. Like you obviously mentioned, you had connections and you were able to introduce them to people. What are the key changes do you think that they needed to make to their pitching and to their argument for fundraise for investors?
Yeah,
that you were able to help them to bridge that gap.
Yeah, I mean, it is, especially at the early stages, it's super important that you get the story right. I often talk about how storytelling is a very critical skill set for founders. You need to be able to tell the story, your own story, the story of your market, the story of your company, kind of how all the pieces fit together, why you're the right person, the right team to deliver this solution into the marketplace. And this is, early on, before there's proof points, before there's commercial traction, before there's probably patents. It's all about the story. The investor is investing in you as a team. Do they believe that you're the right team to solve this problem? And do they believe that this is a big enough problem to go after where, the returns will be ultimately, will fit the profile of their investment criteria? So I think what I did a lot with the team, after meeting them, is really to help them craft the story and to tell the story in a compelling way. It's again, I grew up in marketing. I did my MBA in marketing, and it's kind of this idea of storytelling is something it's a learned skill, and it's something you can practice, but it's super, super important in how you tell the story. And so I think just working with them, helping to tell the story, helping to craft the story in the right way, helping to get a few of the proof points in place that maybe weren't there, and also I would say just acknowledging the gaps in the team. So, no team is going to have 100% of the skills they need, particularly in the early days. So if you say to an investor, I'm really good at this, these aspects, my co-founder is really good at those aspects. And then we recognize that there's, these other things that we need to be able to develop internally. And then potentially you can go out and you can find advisors who can tick a couple of those boxes. And again, this goes back to the point I'd made just a minute ago, which is, if you ask people for help, they will often be willing to help you, often pro bono, because they want to help. I think human beings generally want to share their experience. They want to help coach and develop people and help build things and be part of something exciting. So if you're, in the life sciences field or the biotech field, and there are people doing research in your area that are published, that are well respected, go to them. Tell them what you're doing. Tell them, we love the research you've done. We read your, all your publications. We're really interested in this aspect. It's relevant to our business in this way. We'd love for you to advise us on, how we can perfect the technology, how we can bring this to market, how we can have a big impact. You'll be very successful in kind of building out those additional skill sets that may not be present in the two founders or the founding team, but that you need. Being conscious of the gaps that you have and filling them in creative ways is another thing that just is another proof point to founders to investors that you're the right team to deliver on this. And so that's another thing we did. We went out and built a scientific advisory board, and for Ori that could really help fill in some of the gaps that we had. And then, my experience from the past was also helpful in filling some of those gaps. So that's really kind of how we did it, and what we would kind of advise that others do is really to kind of round out the experience of the team and make sure that your story's right.
Yeah, looking at the storytelling aspect there. So many people listening will have maybe looked at Ori BioTech, seen that you've raised a huge amount of money, but what is the story? So if somebody has never heard of Ori BioTech, what story would you tell them?
At a human level, today we have cures for cancer that patients can't get access to because they can't be manufactured. They're too expensive, and therefore they're inaccessible for patients. What Ori is trying to do is democratize access to this new generation of medicines so that every patient who needs these therapies can get access to them. And so that kind of initial statement is it's trying to connect at a human level, right? So we all know someone who's been impacted by cancer. 10 million people a year die of cancer. Another 10 million people a year are diagnosed with cancer. And this new modality of medicines offers curative potential. So patients that are late stage, they failed every other therapy, are offered cell therapy, and oftentimes between 50 and 70% of the time are cured of cancer. And that is incredible. That is incredible science, but it's also an absolute injustice that only 2% of the patients who could benefit from these therapies actually get access to them. So the other 98% have the worst outcome. So ultimately, if Ori is successful, we'll democratize access for all patients who need them and bring these amazing therapies to first line. And then I go into talk about how we do that and kind of, how the Ori technology is differentiated from other approaches and how it can kind of solve the major problems. The major problem is patient access because the products are too expensive, because they're hard to make, and they can't really be made at the high enough quality and low enough cost to make them available. That's the problem statement that kind of I start with in the pitch, because I think everyone can, whether you're a bioscientist or not, you can sort of identify with that problem. And then we talk about, well, how does Ori's solution fit this problem in a way that's unique, that's compelling? And then, how big is this opportunity? There's 2,700 clinical trials going on in cell and gene therapy today. And it's the number one area of investment by big pharma. So the investment industry has invested over $50 billion in cell and gene therapy in the last 2 years. It's a massive opportunity. And so that, in 20 seconds or less, it's kind of those themes that you see sort of carried out through a conversation about there's a big problem that needs to be solved, or he's got a unique way of solving it that is patented and that is a totally new approach. And if we get it right, it's a massive opportunity, both for patients and economically for the business.
So when you said there about like how big a difference this could potentially make to people who've got cancer, and you go back to kind of 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and you decided, I want to go into healthcare because I can make an impact. Does that now feel like really validating to you? Do you ever like zoom out and see like making that choice way back then has now enabled me to do what I'm doing today and like making such a change? Or do you not like, does that kind of get lost where you don't actually think, oh, wow, like this is...
That's one of those things you think about when you're sort of looking at a sunset and, or you're on vacation, you have a time to kind of mentally de-stress and kind of look up from the trees and see the forest. It's massively gratifying to be involved in a company that has the potential to impact millions of patients positively. I mean, I think that's absolutely what I had hoped to be able to do, all those years ago. And I think part of it was being intentional about the types of opportunities that I took a hold of or tried to get involved in. And part of it's luck, just trying to work hard, add value where you can. One of the things that, may be useful for listeners as well to think about is when I transitioned out of my last business, so the business that went from 5 to 1,100 people over 10 years, we listed the company. I left it in 2016. But at that point, I'd been sort of head down building a business for 10 years, half the time in the US, half the time in the UK. I hadn't taken much time to go out and build my network, certainly not in London or in the UK. And so I could sort of parachuted out of this business and looked around like, well, now what? Now what do I do? How do I get, because I knew I wanted to get back into kind of working with entrepreneurs and startups, but I didn't know how, really. I didn't have any links into the innovation ecosystem in London or in the UK. And I started, going out and meeting people, I got involved with a couple accelerators early that were working with, startup companies pro bono, just trying to add value where I could, if I could. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Going out and meeting people, saying, "Hey, this is what I want to do. Who should I be talking to? Who do I need to get to know? How do I get plugged in?" And again, asking people for a favor. Can you share your expertise with me? And people were very receptive to say, "Yeah, I'm happy to help." And then I would meet with someone, and she would say, go talk to these two people. And I go talk to those two people and have coffee with them. And they'd say, go talk to these two people. And you get this kind of network effect of building that network out, ultimately trying to add value to every conversation that I was in and asking for help. And I think those are very powerful tools to build rapport, to build a network. And every opportunity, including Ori, came through that process, came through the network I built. There was no me sort of applying for jobs on LinkedIn or something that just never, it's just not the way it worked. The way it worked was, I met a company and I said, well, maybe I could invest and I'm happy to help with this. And they said, well, that's great. And I did that. And then met someone over here and went and did that over there. And it was very organic. And I think it holds true for entrepreneurs. Even after you started your business, maintaining those relationships, building those relationships, networking, not only with investors, but with people in the ecosystem, with the people, scientists, with engineers, with other entrepreneurs, with people, strategics that might be partners or might be customers or might eventually be acquirers. People are what makes business go around. And we forget that sometimes because we're so head down, focused on the technology or focused on the business and not thinking about the importance of maintaining those relationships. And so that, when I look at where I've landed here, I'm very, very appreciative for the people that have helped me along the way, that I've met along the way, that have kind of coached me, mentored me, made an introduction for me, for the businesses where I could help. And there's sort of that positive karmic impact of, adding value over here, but also then seeing value come from other areas.
Is there anybody there that you'd like to give a shout out to who you think really made a huge difference?
Yeah, I mean, there's tons. I mean, I think, Barry Clare, who's the chairman of Ori, is actually the one who introduced me to the business. He and I knew each other as investors, and got to know each other through the ecosystem, doing similar things for healthcare businesses. And one day he said, "Hey, Jason, can you come chat with these guys at Ori? I think you might like them." And literally that was the beginning of that story. And I'll try and remember. I'll sort of walk back a thread. And I think I met Barry through another friend called Pam Garside, who's a very well-connected investor and entrepreneur in her own right in the UK. And I met Pam through an accelerator that I was working with at Guys in St. Thomas's. They had a small incubation studio to house startups, and I would sort of be there having office hours on a Wednesday. We did a Dragon's Den event together, pitch event, and giving startups advice on their business. And it's very organic, that kind of red thread of meet a few people here, put yourself out there, go to the events where people you want to get to know are, and oftentimes they're free. They're free events. I just did an event last Thursday hosted by Google Cloud and our social agency Somex. There are 150 health tech entrepreneurs in the room and members of the ecosystem. Myself and Joe from Cambridge Epigenetics were on stage talking about the experiences of our businesses and how they got to where they are, and how to raise money, and how to build a business, and how to find a team, and all those cool things. So it's a totally free event for people to go to, and just put yourself out there, get involved in the ecosystem, try and add value where you can. Good things will happen.
Yeah, and you said you've invested in other companies as well. Since you became the CEO of Ori BioTech, are you still involved in those other companies as well? Have you stepped back a bit from them?
I am, yeah. So I sit on the board of 4 companies, so Ori and 3 others. So one's called Grippable. It's a neurorehabilitation startup that helps people with upper limb rehab. So people who had a stroke or traumatic brain injury, cerebral palsy, and they've gamified rehab to make it fun so people actually engage with it, and are dramatically improving patient engagement and clinical outcomes by doing that. And I invested. They were actually my very first angel investment 5 years ago. And to the point we just raised, I met Paul Rinne, the CEO there, through Deep Science Ventures, who was a startup that I was startup incubator that I was working with, through Dom and Mark over there. So, I mean, again, it's an ecosystem reward or benefit. But so Grippable is doing really interesting things. They've just landed in the US with a distribution partner there, really trying to get access to rehabilitation hospitals, doing some really interesting work for patients there. So I sit on the board of that company. But when I invested in them 5 years ago, I said, I'm going to help you. So I'm going to try and help you get where you want to go. When I joined Ori full time, obviously they expect my full time attention, which they get. But I also said I've made commitments to companies like Grippable to help them, and I sit on their board, and I'm not going to abandon them. I promised to help those guys, and so the board of Ori was quite happy to allow me to continue to do some of those things. So I sit on the board of Grippable. I sit on the board of another company called Credentially, who I met through Techstars, the accelerator there. Invested in them several years ago. They're solving clinician onboarding challenges, so bringing clinical staff into a healthcare providing organization, be it NHS or private, is incredibly difficult, paper-based process. So much so that 70% of the candidates who start out at the top of the funnel drop out before they get to the bottom, because it's like emailing back and forth pictures of your passport, and you cut off a little piece of it, and they're like, well, we didn't get it, and you can't do this, and it takes too long to turn that around, and I lose the email and delete it by accident. It's just a nightmare. So it cuts a 90-day process today into 1 day, and allows you to rapidly onboard clinicians in a situation where we've got massive clinicians shortages across the UK and the US as well. This is a really important tool to get people kind of in and working quickly. And then finally, I sit on the board of a company called Auxita, and they're solving the kind of administrative burden for clinicians, so doctors, to essentially communicate with pharma companies and their agents. So if you think about, they'll have nurses who call them, help with their administration, or they help with, co-payments, costs, et cetera. So these types of programs are administered by usually pharma companies themselves, or people like a McKesson or AmerisourceBergen, so these big companies. But it's all done by paper. So they're filling out massive forms. They're faxing them, if you can imagine such a thing, faxing them or scanning them, sending them in to someone else who then had data entries on their side. So essentially, Auxita's automated all of that communication for essentially clinician to pharma company communication. So adverse event reporting, for example, patient support programs, signups, prior authorizations to get access to medications. So really important infrastructure for digital infrastructure for those clinicians and those companies. So it's a breadth of different types of approaches, and I'm certainly not an expert in SaaS or some of these other business models, but it's all really going to where kind of technology and healthcare intersect is really my area of interest, and where we see the most opportunity for. We don't say disruption in healthcare because it scares everybody. The most opportunity for evolution and efficiency gain, because healthcare generally is a laggard in the technology adoption curve, and the people in the healthcare system will say, "Well, that's by design, because if we move too quickly, then people get hurt." Actually, it's probably not that reason. 60% of the patient records in the UK today, the patient health records, are still in paper. Rather than being in an EMR system, which the rest of the world has adopted at scale. So I just think a lot of it is inertia and kind of latency and misaligned incentives, which a lot of these companies try to address.
How hard do you find it to manage your kind of different priorities? Because obviously, as you said, like Ori BioTech are allowing you the time to work with other companies too and sit on their board. But do you ever find it difficult to kind of switch hats? And do you think sitting on multiple boards has also given you the opportunity to take lessons from one company and apply them to another? And have you got any examples of where that's happened?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely complementary. So the time issue and the kind of value issue are two different questions. So the time issue is I don't sleep very much. That's how I managed to do all this stuff. So my board meetings for Auxita start at 10 p.m. usually, because it's first thing in the morning in Australia and kind of mid-afternoon in Canada. So we've got some scheduling challenges there. But so, you just kind of squeeze it in. I mean, I think this kind of myth of work-life balance, what I call it is work-life integration. How do I fit the things I want to do professionally with the things I want to do personally and make the pieces fit together? So, I get up in the morning, I help get the kids off to school. I usually try and get to the gym if I can, 3 or 4 days a week. That happens usually 8 to 9 in the morning. And then I come back and I'm on the phone for 9:30 or 10 o'clock in a meeting. And then I'll go till, 5:30, want to be there for dinner with the children and have that time. And then maybe 9 o'clock, I'll log back on in the average day and work for a couple hours at night. I'm a night owl, so I'm most productive between 9 and 12. But, if I need to take off and go to a sports day at 2 p.m., you schedule it in. And it's the same with the various, hats, the kind of Ori commitments. I don't know how many hours I work a week. I don't really track it, but it's plenty to get the work done. But when you're enjoying what you do and you're passionate about what you do, it doesn't feel like work really. It's sort of, you do get tired, and there are times where you're kind of burning the candle at both ends. But, I do think that sleep, 7 hours of sleep religiously, getting to the gym, trying to eat right when I can. It's hard when you travel, but making time for family priorities. Those things are super important. So getting that balance right across all of the various commitments I have is a focus, and you need to focus on them. As it relates to the value of those various hats that I wear, I absolutely think it's synergistic. I see the challenges that one of the businesses is going through, or I'll meet investors through that director's hat. And be talking to them and say, actually, it's a similar challenge over here, or that's something that Ori's facing, or actually that investor might be interested in what we're doing at Ori versus what we're doing at, Prudentially. I met a great consultant actually through one of the businesses who's helping on another business that I'm working in, because they had deep expertise in an area that, several of the businesses that I'm working with needed. So, meet people again, the kind of network, pull them into various elements. It's as you sort of talk about the the puzzle, you see sort of some of the pieces coming into place and how they work together to create value.
One thing I think is interesting is that like you're working on the 4 different boards now, so you're including Ori BioTech, but it's already after you've had a big exit in the past. So do you think your motivations change over time, maybe where you're even working long hours now, even though I guess financially you're well off enough that you don't need to? Do you think that when you started off, it was potentially you had more of that motivation where you needed to get to a certain point? Whereas now, I guess you're doing it more out of just sheer enjoyment. And it's more, like you said, whether it's work and life, it's kind of merging together because if you're enjoying what you're doing, then it's not so much work as just life.
Yeah, there is a little bit of that. I mean, it was a massive exit for our investors. And it was a $3.5 billion enterprise value listing of that pharma company that we put together. So we made a lot of money for them, which is great. I made a little bit of money for myself. But it does change your perspective, in that, you don't necessarily have to worry about where the next rent check is going to come from or the next day's, groceries. And it allowed me to engage in ways with startups that, maybe some people couldn't, and that I could commit financially to them as well as my sort of expertise. And that showed, obviously, putting some skin in the game, shows commitment. So it does afford me a bit of perspective and a bit more comfort. But, I still have 2 children that are in private school in London, and it's not inexpensive to live here. So, those financial commitments are still there. But, I think it's sort of, I was lucky to have the opportunity to leave my last business and to find something else that I love doing. So I, started my own consultancy business. I was working with a bunch of cool startups and some cool investors, learning a bunch about, integrating into the ecosystem. Was making enough money to survive at that point. When you start your own business, you never know if the phone's going to ring. It's sort of hang your own shingle out. And that's one of the things I tell people who want to make a transition from like a big pharma job. A lot of people look at me like, you were a pharma executive, pharma brand manager, and then general manager. How did you make the jump to startups and startup CEO and investors? And a lot of it is that personal kind of network building that I said, but also bringing the skill sets, being flexible. I won't hire someone into Ori who's has spent 20 years in pharma, because they are used to the trappings of a big company. They're used to having someone to plan their travel, and they're used to having, all the things that you would expect as a big executive. So there's a mindset shift to say, well, you need to see some of those, the demonstration of an entrepreneurial mindset, someone who's taken the leap. They've been in the arena, the Roosevelt quote about, you don't really understand it until you're in the arena. And people have to be willing to roll their sleeves up and get their hands dirty. And that, what I try to demonstrate with the companies I work with, I'm willing to kind of put my shoulder to the rock with them and get my hands dirty and try and help them really build the business. Because that's really what I get a ton of pleasure out of, is the building process, building the business is a super exciting element to startups.
And say for the next year or so, what's exciting you the most about like Ori BioTech or whatever you're working on? What do you think is like really driving you forwards?
The next kind of 12 to 18 months for Ori are super exciting. So we are moving from an R&D focus, so product development, into a commercial kind of clinical focus. So we will be launching the first version of the platform into the market. We're engaging with customers who are going to be using us to do preclinical and ultimately clinical work on the platform. So we'll see the first patients getting treated with products that are made on the Ori platform. And that is a massive milestone, not only kind of emotionally for all of us that have been, really working hard to reach that result, but also for the company, is demonstrating clearly that the product works, that works as we said it would. It can demonstrate value, that it has an economic impact, that customers are willing to pay for it. One of the questions I always ask startups when I'm looking at opportunities to invest is, who's going to pay for it and why? So there's 2 different questions there that are equally important to each other, is to understand what the motivations of your customers are and what's their needs, but also, are they willing to pay for it? One of the biggest challenges with health tech that I see when they try and sell into the NHS, for example, is that we don't really understand the motivations of the people involved in the NHS, because it's such a fragmented system. This idea of a national health service doesn't really exist. There's 10,000 payers in the NHS, and they all have their own incentives, their own budgets, their own priorities. And the people that use your technology, likely if it's a clinician, isn't the person who actually makes the buying decision. So clinicians can say no, but they can't say yes. And then you have to convince someone on the other side of the house in the procurement office that they need to actually pay for this thing. And that's a very hard thing to do. And that's one where actually a lot of startups fail. They can get a clinical pilot, but they can never convert them to a customer. So from an Ori perspective, having those first revenues come in, we're slightly revenue generating at the moment, but first significant revenues, demonstrating product market fit, demonstrating the impact that we can have in the market, generating the first data from the first kind of commercial use of the platform. These are all massive milestones for us to really demonstrate and show that we've done what we set out to do, and that it can have the impact on patients that we hope we can have. So super exciting next 18 months for us.
Could you give a quick overview of the business model itself? So who's the customers and how are they paying, or what's the model there?
So Ori, at its highest level, is a cell and gene therapy manufacturing technology company. So we work with people developing therapeutics to make them more quickly, more efficiently, more cost effectively. So we will work with basically three segments of the market. One will be early stage kind of academic researchers. So people like a Sloan Kettering or a MD Anderson or a UCL who are developing new therapeutic approaches to treat disease. So they will develop their interventions or their platforms or their technologies on the Ori platform in a preclinical kind of lab context. So that's one customer group, and that actually obviously feeds the next two groups. So that academic research often then becomes therapeutics companies that spin out or get funded. And then, so therapy developers are the second customer segment for us. And that might range from, enormous companies like a Novartis or a Janssen or a BMS or a Kite that have first generation products that are already in the market or have a pipeline of products, all the way down to, brand new startups that's like, 2 or 3 people. So that kind of span of therapy developers that are developing those 2,700 clinical trials today will be a core element. That's probably the lion's share of the market for us. And then there's a group of service providers called CDMOs, so contract development manufacturing organizations, that they develop processes and make products on behalf of therapy developers. So they would use our platform to do their work on behalf of therapy developers, which will make them more efficient. That'll obviously make them more profitable. So they can essentially charge the therapy developer the same, but make more money doing so because they don't need as many people. They don't need as much space. So really the kind of value proposition is, right now these processes are highly manual. You need very, very high levels of expertise and a lot of people in very large facilities to develop and manufacture these products. If we can automate a lot of those components and also take out the knowledge requirement, so the system actually brings the knowledge to the process versus the individual, and it allows the individuals who are involved then to do more kind of higher level tasks versus kind of rote manufacturing tasks. So really, that's kind of how we create value. Is we make it much more flexible at the early phase so that they can do their drug discovery more quickly, more efficiently, and then make it scalable so that we can reach tens of thousands of patients or hundreds of thousands of patients, which today can't be done physically. There's a physical kind of limitation in the amount of doses that we can create, and doing so in a much quicker, much more efficient, much more cost-effective way. We think ultimately we'll be able to shave years off the drug development timeline for a product, so get it to patients, years earlier than it would have otherwise, and for a half to 20% of the cost that it costs today. So really hoping that, if you have a cure for cancer, why would you be keeping it as the last thing that you do versus the first thing that you do? Well, today's reality is, it's too expensive to deliver to patients as first line. They have to go through, for some patients, chemo works. For some patients, immunotherapy works, or a transplant might work. And so you whittle down the numbers until you get a manageable number where there really isn't another intervention. And then a very small subset of those patients are actually able to get the therapy. What if we could treat 10,000 or 100,000 patients that are, every year getting non-small cell lung cancer or pancreatic cancer or ovarian cancer first line with the best treatment for them, potentially? That's the future. That's where we'll get to in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, and that's amazing to hear. And it's just for Like, I think for anybody listening who's known somebody who's got cancer or has had cancer themselves, it's just great to know that this kind of thing is available and is being worked on. And
Absolutely.
if people want to hear more about Ori BioTech and also just hear more about you and what you're up to and your own journey, where's the best place for them to go to?
So at Ori, we do a podcast. So it's called the Ori Spotlight Podcast, which unfortunately you'll have to listen to me talk quite a lot, but I have some really interesting guests that, experts in the field that come talk about the field and what we do and how we do it. And so you can go to oribiotech.com and access, our content on the website and really get a better idea about cell and gene therapy and about what Ori is trying to accomplish. And then as for me, I'm on LinkedIn. That's probably my social media of choice. My email address is on there. My phone number is on there. People can reach out to me or message me through LinkedIn. I'm very happy, particularly with founders and entrepreneurs who are on a journey of their own. I'll always have time to try and respond to folks and see if I can help, see if I can connect you with somebody who could help if I can, and to be part of the journey. I'd love to help if I can, and please do reach out. Very happy to respond.
Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks again for having me. Really appreciate it.